Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is the second lecture for Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled The 10 Principles of Economics. This lecture will focus on the first four of those principles titled, subgrouped, How People Make Decisions. Okay, so if you've ever traveled abroad, you might have encountered what's called a tourist platter, right? So you go, you want to experience all of the, or as much of the food or culture as you can, but maybe you're going to be in this place a limited amount of time. And so a lot of restaurants in touristy places around the world will have a tourist platter where you can try small little bits of their famous food all in one platter. You don't get a ton of each dish, but you get a little bit of each just to kind of so you can sample it. Well, the reason I bring that up is because that's basically what Chapter 1 is in our ManQ microeconomics textbook. Chapter 1 is called The 10 Principles of Economics. These are not in any way the only principles of economics. Also, each of these principles is very, very broad. And again, that's because this is just a tourist platter. Chapter 1 is just going to kind of take us through, and we're going to hit some very big ideas in the field of economics, and we're going to go in depth with these ideas much later in this, or really throughout the semester. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The 10 principles are here. I'm not going to read them to you because we're going to be discussing most of these. The first four are grouped into how people make decisions. That's what this lecture will be on. Lecture 3 will cover the next three, which are how people interact. And then I want to show you these, although I've got to be honest, I'm not going to discuss these. The last three principles discussed in Chapter 1 are how the economy as a whole works. These are mainly macroeconomic principles, okay, which are covered best in a macroeconomics class. That might be Econ 230 here at Murray State, or maybe another course somewhere else. But we're going to discuss a little bit of maybe Principle 8, maybe at a later time this semester, but these other ones we won't really touch, and so you won't be required to really interact with those. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the first of these principles, these micro principles. And the first principle is that people face trade-offs. Okay, if I asked you which of these would you rather be doing right now, sitting in class or sleeping, you'd probably say sleeping. That's fine. Okay, but why do you often have to choose, right? Many days there, you would like to continue sleeping, but you need to go to class, and assuming that you're not sleeping during class. Why do you have to choose? Because your time is scarce. We discussed this in the definition of economics. Scarcity is what economics is all about. Because scarcity exists, right, we face choices of how to allocate our scarce resources. Okay, so people face trade-offs. Governments face trade-offs. A very famous trade-off that governments face around the world is guns versus butter. Now, what we mean by that when we say guns versus butter is for every dollar that a government spends on military goods, everything else constant, right, that's $1 less that we have for consumer goods, butter, or things like healthcare, or things like that, right? So, how much should our government be spending on, military and defense versus how much should our government be spending on consumer-type goods, healthcare, and other things like that? I don't have the answer for you. I'm just saying that's a trade-off, right? A dollar spent in one category is one less dollar for the other category. The reason for that is because of scarcity. We face choices. We face trade-offs. Another famous trade-off that policymakers face is the efficiency versus equity trade-off, right? Efficiency meaning getting the most out of our resources, right? Working hard and producing a lot, right? Versus equity, which has more to do with equal distribution. These, and we'll look at this trade-off a lot more as the semester progresses, but these are not always, but typically these two things are trade-offs. The policies that tend to promote efficiency, okay, and maybe more work ethic and so on, more investment and so on and so forth, those policies that promote these things tend to take away from equal distribution or equity, and vice versa. Policies that tend to promote equal distribution of resources tend to dampen efficiency. And so we'll see that trade-off in several different specific contexts later this semester. But it's a trade-off that many policymakers face. In other words, what we're trying to say is that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Whether it's a policy, whether it's government spending, whether it's your personal life, you often cannot have your cake and eat it too. That's a famous expression, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. There's always a cost. Okay, that's a very core principle of economics. And how do we measure that cost? Well, the cost of your decision is whatever you give up to get it. Okay, that's our second principle. And we call this specifically opportunity cost. And so, again, an opportunity cost does not have to be monetary. So, for example, several years ago, the Murray State's basketball team was undefeated, and students, the games became very popular, even more popular than they typically are, and students would stand in line outside of the CFSB Center for sometimes days, at least 1 or 2 days in advance of a game, to get in so they could get good seats. Now, the game, obviously, is free for students. They just flashed their ID and got in for free. Okay, they were waiting in line to get a good seat. So does that mean that decision was free for the students just because they don't have to pay anything monetarily? Of course not, right? The time that these students spent waiting in line, maybe they had to skip work or take off work. Maybe they skipped classes, missed quizzes, missed an exam. Maybe they missed homework assignments. Whatever it is that they missed, right, during that time of them standing in line was their cost, was their opportunity cost of that decision. Now, I'm not saying they made a good or a bad decision. I'm just simply saying that they did have a cost. And it's whatever you give up to get it, not just monetary expenses. Your cost can be much more than monetary. The next principle is that rational people think at the margin. Now, we need to break this one down a little bit. This is the third principle. Rational people think at the margin. Okay, what we mean by rationality is that people don't tend. It's common to hear the cliche, well, that people are stupid. Well, in economics, we tend to assume that, and we can actually prove in a lot of cases that people aren't that stupid. Okay, we may like to poke fun at ourselves, but in the grand context, we're really not that stupid. In other words, what we mean is we're trying to maximize our happiness. That's just kind of putting it mildly, right? We're trying to maximize our utility. We're trying to do the best that we can, make the best decisions we can with the available information, which basically means when the perceived benefits of a certain decision are greater than the perceived costs of a decision, we're going to tend to make that decision. We're not that stupid, right? And when the perceived costs are greater than the perceived benefits, we're not going to make the decision. This is something that we see typically hold. Now, this does not at all mean that all people are going to make the same decisions. For example, spouses. Some spouses will stay home with their kids. They'll delay their career advancement. They'll not work for a few years and stay home with their kids. Whereas others might go to work full time and send their kids to daycare. Does that mean that one party is behaving, rationally and the other is not? Well, of course not, right? Each family has to make, their own decisions, and they have their own benefits. They have their own perceived costs. All we're trying to say is in economics is that when the perceived benefits are greater than the perceived costs of a decision, we will tend to say that people will behave rationally and go ahead and make that decision. Okay? Now, that does not mean to say that people sometimes aren't what we call irrational. There's a whole field of economics called behavioral economics that does look at and study how people systematically deviate from rationality. I'll just give you an example. If I were to ask you, is there anyone, that that's scared of flying? Right? And you would probably say, yes, that might be you. You might be scared of flying. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that, except to say, if you're scared of flying to the extent that you never fly in an airplane, my guess is that you drive a car, or you at least ride in a car. Okay? And that actually is irrational if that's true for someone because flying is far safer than driving is. Yet most people who are scared of flying and won't step foot on an airplane happily drive to and fro every single day. That technically, right, is irrational. And so there's little things like that where we do, as human beings, sometimes behave irrationally. This can complicate some of our models that we'll look at this semester, but let me give you this example. Have you ever used a map, right? Maybe on your phone, maybe somewhere else. Maps don't have all the information that you could possibly want for a city, right? So, for example, if you're in Chicago and you have a map of Chicago, your map might not have all of the streets. It might not even have the correct street names all the time. It might not have all the buildings. It might not have the traffic patterns. It might not have elevation. It's not going to have a lot of information. But if you're lost in Chicago, don't you think this imperfect map will still help you find where you need to go? At least it'll be somewhat helpful, if not incredibly helpful. Of course it would be, right? Maps, even though they don't have all of the information we might need or might even want, maps can still be incredibly useful for helping us get where we need to go, especially if we're lost. That's the same thing with that's also true for our economic models. Our economic models are not going to be perfect representations of reality, but they're going to be useful still for pointing us in the right direction of how reality looks and helping us draw some conclusions that are relevant to reality. And so that's just like a map. And so that's what we're dealing with here. So rational people, okay, think at the margin. What do we mean by the margin? Okay, marginal changes. All the word marginal means is extra. So when we say marginal changes, it's simply an incremental adjustment to an existing plan of action. So for example, if I told you, that we have a test coming up, we have a test next week, you would probably already begin to formulate a plan for, okay, maybe the day before I'll block off the afternoon and, for maybe 4 hours, and I'll study for this test. Okay, I'm planning on studying for 4 hours, right? And then maybe as we approach the test, so you already planned to study for 4 hours, maybe the class before we were supposed to have the exam, maybe we go over some material and you realize you have absolutely no idea what's going on. You realize you're not as prepared as you thought you were. Well, then how might you adjust? Well, you might say, okay, all of a sudden, because I realized I don't know what I'm doing, the extra benefits of maybe studying an extra hour or two, adding another hour or two to my studying, to maybe 5 or 6 hours, might be greater than the marginal costs of studying, right? And so again, you're going to make a marginal decision where you're going to compare the extra benefits to studying an extra hour or two, compare that to the extra costs of studying an hour or two, and then make that decision. It's an adjustment to an existing plan of action. Let me apply this to another example, okay, just to make this clear. So let's just say there's an airplane flying across country. It's got 200 seats. The total cost of this plane flying across the country is $100,000. If you divide $100,000 by 200, that's an average cost of $500 per seat. Okay, let's just say that the plane has not sold all their seats. Let's just say they've sold 3/4 of them, 150 seats. They've got 50 extra seats available. Okay, now let's just say that the plane is going to take off. They've decided that 3/4 of the plane being full is more than enough for them to make money, and so they're about to take off. Well, let's just say a passenger comes up to the desk and says, hey, that flight that's about to take off, I'd really like to be on that flight. I really need to get there. I'm willing to pay $300 for a seat. Okay, so that's the scenario. The plane's about to take off. They've got some extra seats. Someone's offering them something below what their average cost is. If the airline is profit maximizing, should they sell the seat for $300? Okay, assuming that's the most they can get from this customer. Okay, well, again, thinking about this from a marginal standpoint is different from thinking about it on an average standpoint. So if I'm just looking at average cost, of course I would say no, $300 is less than $500. But think about this flight is already taking off. Okay, so what is the extra cost for a flight that's already going to happen? What is the extra cost to the airline of bringing on another passenger? Almost nothing, right? I mean, there would be a little bit extra luggage and the person, so there'd be a little bit extra weight, which would probably cause them to use a little bit of extra fuel, okay, but marginally. They might have to use some extra bags of peanuts and pretzels and maybe an extra drink. But, I mean, we're talking almost nothing, right? The marginal cost is almost zero versus what's the extra benefit of selling this ticket? Well, obviously $300. And so if you look at it from a marginal standpoint, right, comparing marginal benefits to marginal costs, it would make perfect sense for this airline to go, in this scenario, to go ahead and sell the ticket to this passenger for $300. Again, that's comparing the marginal benefits to marginal costs. This is, when we look at our economic models, this is how we're going to model most of our whether it's family, individual, or firm decision making, because this is the type of analysis that will make the most sense in our context. Okay, so rational people will tend to think at the margin. Then the last principle in this category is that people respond to incentives. People, again, are not that stupid. When there's an incentive, people respond to that incentive. Let's look at an obvious one, right? When gas prices go up, prices are incentives. And when gas prices go up, of course, we have emotional reactions. We're ticked off. We're mad. Okay, but guess what we also do? We drive less. Okay? For example, in 2008, when there were massive gas prices were really high back in 2008 across the country. They were $4.50, $5 a gallon. Well, guess what? That also was the same year that we saw the first monthly drop in miles driven in 30 years. People were driving less for the first time in a long time. Transit ridership was higher in 2008 than at any time in the last 50 years. SUV sales, gas guzzler sales plummeted, and subcompact sales rose. Green energy investment increased. People were investing in wind and solar and other alternative energies, right, to try to move away from gas. None of this was by government direction, by government action, right? This was all simply people responding to the incentives of high gas prices. So we respond to incentives, and some incentive that's pretty self-explanatory, right? That's pretty obvious. Prices of gas goes up. We're going to try to avoid using as much gasoline as we can, okay? But some incentives aren't as obvious. Some incentives are what we call perverse incentives. They create secondary effects that aren't necessarily immediately obvious to the untrained eye. So one example is in colonial India. The British had colonized India, and they sent, obviously, government officials to manage the territory. And one of the things that they wanted to do was get rid of the snakes. There's lots of poisonous snakes in India, and the British weren't used to that, and they didn't like it. So they came up with a policy to try to decrease the snake population. Okay, and so what they said was, to the local population, they said, if you go out and find a snake and kill it and bring us the dead snake, we will give you a monetary reward. Okay? This policy was intended to get rid of the snakes by paying people to bring them dead snakes. If you think about it for just a second, though, you can maybe begin to think through what some profit-maximizing incentives might be for the local population, right? If I'm a local and I don't have very many good employment opportunities, and the government's telling me they'll pay me to bring them dead snakes, I would not want to go out and kill all the snakes, because then that would destroy my only employment opportunity. Instead, what I might do is find a male and a female snake and do what? How about create a snake farm, right? And breed the snakes. I would take some of the snakes to market, to kill them and take them to the government for my money, but I surely wouldn't take all of them, because I would want to have a consistent cash flow year after year. So basically, these snake farms, these ranching operations around snakes began to develop. You might think about it much like a cattle operation here in the United States, only this was with snakes in India. And that's what began to happen. Of course, the British government found out about it and was furious. They couldn't believe that the local population had created snake farms as a response to their policy. So they immediately canceled the policy. They said, we're not paying anyone for any more dead snakes. Well, of course, what do you think the local population did? With the cash flow gone, they immediately abandoned their snake farms and released the snakes into the wild. Well, again, this policy was intended to get rid of the snakes, only because of the incentives, do you think there were more or less snakes after the policy? There were more snakes after the policy than before the policy. The policy created a perverse incentive to actually create more snakes in the environment rather than less. And so, again, people will respond to the incentives created by policy. Let's look at one more, or a couple more. One of the most influential books in the 20th century, at least on U.S. domestic policy, was by Ralph Nader, called Unsafe at Any Speed. This book was basically about safety features on cars and how the lack of safety features on cars in the 1950s and 60s was creating an unsafe situation for drivers. And so, because of his book, a lot of safety features like seat belts, dual braking systems, and a lot of other systems became mandatory on all car models in the United States during the 1960s. Okay, and of course, this is a good thing. Safety features are good on cars, but economists are going to ask the obvious question, which is, how will this influence human behavior? Well, this was studied. The impact of these safety features on cars was studied in the 1970s by Sam Peltzman, a very influential study, and this is what he found. He found that there were fewer deaths per accident. If you got into an accident in a car with seat belts and airbags and so on, you were more likely to survive the crash. That should be obvious, right? And that's good. That's a good thing, okay? However, he also found that there were more accidents, okay? And in fact, this second effect was greater than the first effect, meaning that overall, there were actually more automobile deaths after the policy than before, controlling for other factors. Now, you might begin to think through, how could that be? How could there be more deaths after cars are safer? Well, because cars were safer, how do you think drivers might have responded? Well, Sam Peltzman found that drivers responded to the new safety measures by driving less safely. This was so influential and so just powerful that it was actually named the Peltzman effect. It's this idea that safety features or maybe legislation policy trying to make us safer can actually make us less safe because how we as consumers respond to those safety features. Okay? So again, drivers were, if I'm in a safe car with a seatbelt, airbags, braking systems, and so on, I might feel, a little bit safer to take a curve a little bit faster, or to go a little bit faster over the speed limit, or to not be as cautious, maybe going in and out of traffic, right? These were the things he found that increased overall deaths as a result of these features. He also found that there were more pedestrian deaths as a result of this legislation. And again, we might think through this. If I'm driving more recklessly, the safety features in my car will protect me, right, and make it less likely for me to die. But who will it not protect? Well, clearly it will not protect pedestrians. Okay, and so again, this idea that people will respond to incentives. Obviously, safety features are a good thing. I'm not saying that they're bad, but it's simply saying that we will respond to incentives, and it's important for policymakers to think through, right, how people will respond to various incentives of policy so that we can create effective policy. Now, along these same lines, just an interesting factoid about the National Football League and safety. You might have been following recent developments about concussions and settlements and so on and so forth. Lots of former football players are having, brain injuries and things like that because of head-on-head or head-to-head collisions with helmets. And the chairman of the National Football League's Health and Safety Advisory Commission, he believes that American football could ban helmets in the near future. Banning helmets. Now, again, that would be very difficult to understand if we didn't just talk through incentives, right? And so why could he say that he believes that they could ban helmets in the future if they're having all these problems with head injuries? Well, think about it, right? His point is that the helmet that a football player has makes them feel safer. It gives them a false sense of protection. So many football players, because of that helmet, will tackle leading with the crown of their head towards another player's helmet or something, which causes a lot of these, brain injuries and these, head collisions and causes a lot of problems. And what his point is in the future, it's possible that they might say that it's actually safer for players not to have helmets, because if a player didn't have a helmet, what might they do? Well, if I don't have a helmet on, I might not feel as safe, and therefore I might decide not to try to tackle you by leading with my head, which, based on the analysis we just talked through, or the logic we just talked through, that actually might decrease head collisions as opposed to increasing them. It's just food for thought. But these are the first four principles of economics. They're called how people make decisions. People face trade-offs. The cost of something is what you give up to get it. Rational people think at the margin, and people respond to incentives.